Today on Public Research.
They showed that we can reclaim urban space. They showed that it's possible and that there's something worth saving here in the city. It's about focusing on the people who actually commit the crime, because there are not that many of them.
Enjoy a typical afternoon in New York City.
From 1990 to 2000, New York City saw a 70% reduction in annual murders. How did they do it? Today on Public Research, Professor Peter Moskos returns to discuss his new book, Back from the Brink, Inside the NYPD and New York City's Extraordinary 1990s Crime Drop, which tells the story of how a 1982 article in the Atlantic magazine about broken windows, Commissioner Bill Bratton, his right-hand man Jack Maple, Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and others created COMPSTAT and ended up changing policing forever. We discuss New York City's amazing transformation from the gritty darkness of the 70s to the Disneyfication of Times Square, and also get Moskos' assessment of New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani's controversial public safety plan as well. All that and more on today's edition of Public Research. When I saw that it was partially an oral history, I was like, oh, this is such a great idea. I love oral history books. The way they flow is always so easy to read.
You know what's funny is I don't like oral histories. I like history. And I don't know if we mentioned this before. I'm not certain if this is true, but I haven't found any others. I think this is a novel form for oral history, the idea of not not having commentary between quotes. Because I usually find oral history is a bit disjointed, or like, well, they just said it. You don't have to tell me what they said. So I did set out to write, I guess an oral history, but in a way that, I don't think has been done before, in a way I would like. So that's.
You might have you heard of the book Lexicon Devil about the punk rocker Darby Crash?
No.
He was the lead singer of the Germs.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds really, you might not be interested. Great book, but it's an oral history, a lot like yours. Very interesting about the sort of LA punk world.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, first of all, why did you feel a need to write this book? And then can you talk about the journey of doing the interviews?
Yeah, I'd love to. The need goes back to when I started grad school in 1995, and I'm at Harvard, and all the so-called experts are saying that crime can't go down till we fix society. And meanwhile, murders in New York are down 50%, by 1996. And I'm thinking, wow, everybody's wrong. It's probably a good field to get into if all the experts are wrong. It's why I went into policing as a field, basically, was the New York City crime drop. And so I've always wondered, what happened? And then I started this book. The first interview was done in 2014. So it's a very long journey. And I had some ideas. I didn't know what I was doing yet when I started the interviews. I just had access to cops, basically. So I didn't know what I was going to write or what era it was going to cover. I thought it would be like 1990 to the present at first. And then as I talked to the people who were there, I went back 2 decades to when they started, and also realized partly, I needed it for length reasons, but I needed a hard end before September 11th, 2001, because in an oral history, you can't say, oh, and then that happened, and move on. And I didn't want to go there, basically, because it's not about the crime drop. So that ended the book in the 90s. But as I'm interviewing these cops, originally I did not think it was going to be an oral history. And then, I don't know when, but relatively quickly, I think, by quickly, relatively quickly, I mean years, I realized, like, why am I going to paraphrase these guys? They say things so well, and their voices are so good. Um, I should just let them do the talking. And, because I had access and because, it's generally, it's not considered an easy group to talk and get to speak openly. But I think because of my policing background and a lot of it, one guy calls up another and says, "Oh yeah, I just did an interview. This guy's okay." Because I mean, some of them I knew, but many of them I didn't, and I, only met basically for the interview, um, and did the interview and sort of, get some more names from them and move on. But it's also there's a lot of cutting because, as I learned, there are roughly 10,000 words in an hour of conversation, and the book uh, is in the end it turned out to be 120,000 words, so that's only 12 hours. And I have hundreds of hours of interviews, so you know a lot of it is repetitive. So that's easy to cut, but you got to make choices, and you have to figure out sort of who you're going to include in the book. And I felt bad leaving people out, but there are 30 people. That's a lot already for the reader to keep track of. So everyone, in my mind, has a very specific purpose that they add to the book, but others could have been included. But it's amazing how uniform the story was told. Generally, I mean, there are different opinions, but uh, very in the qualitative world that's called saturation. Very quickly, I realized, I'm getting the same story from these people, which is good in many ways because it verifies it. Um, and then, it was partly I thought it would be easier to do an oral history because writing is work, and I sort of enjoy editing, and I don't really enjoy writing. But man, oh man, the
Well,
time it takes.
you do write. It's not all just interviews, and I think you do a really great job in setting the scene in the '70s. But why don't we back up? Because one thing I neglected to ask you about last time was your very interesting personal journey. So tell me, how does a kid from the leafy, affluent northern suburb of Evanston, Illinois, end up
It's
as a
always
ball?
described as leafy. It is leafy though.
How
And
does
North Evanston at that, the leafier part.
yeah? How does Evanston, a Chicagoland kid, end up a Baltimore police officer, and then end up at Harvard, and then end up in New York?
Well, I'm a proud graduate of ETHS, Evanston High School, um, and did my undergrad at Princeton. Was a bit shocked and disturbed at stumbling into sort of the American upper class and the snobbery, and I wasn't generally very happy at Princeton and took a year off. And there's a lot of privilege before that was word was thrown around, and that um, yeah, I couldn't figure. I mean, I didn't understand it. I didn't know what a prep school was. If you went to a private school, it either means you're in Chicago going to a Catholic school, or you're some fuck up with drug or alcohol problems. But like everyone went to public school, and it was really diverse. Um, and my parents were both teachers, which I mean, I doubt I would have gone in academia were it not for that. Um, and at Harvard, I spent a year in Amsterdam first with my brother's theater, Boom Chicago. Uh, and I wanted to study something urban related because I grew up a city kid. Um, and then the crime drop came to my attention, and I saw it was sort of a under researched and often wrong field. Um, but when I was going to follow in the footsteps of John Van Manen, who was at MIT at the time, and he wrote a book about going through the Seattle Police Academy, not quite as a cop, but sort of, in the late 60s, and the socialization of police officers. And he's a really nice guy and a good writer. So I was going to replicate his study. And Baltimore was one of the two cities that said I could, both because of Greek American connections, by the way. No rational police department would have let me do what I did. But the guy who approved, so I went to Baltimore in the fall of '99 and not planning on being a cop. And the guy who approved my research quit, went to Washington, went to DC, um, and the acting commissioner, and this is on day one of the academy, the acting commissioner basically disapproved my research. And I asked to have a meeting with him. I don't even know if he knew I was there at that moment, to be honest. But and I didn't realize how unusual it was for not even a trainee to go into the police commissioner's office in khaki pants and plead basically. And he had mercy on me. He said, "Well, I said if I go back, I'm a failure. Like I moved here. I don't have a place to live." And I was surprised how much empathy being a Harvard grad student got me in the Baltimore Police Department because I expected the opposite. But he asked straight up, "Why don't you become a cop for real?" And I said, "Who would hire me, knowing that I'm going to quit after a year and write a book?" And I stayed a bit longer, but and he said I would if you. So I went through the hiring process while I was in the academy, which has never been done before or since, and officially got hired on December 6th, and then I ended up, staying. The question is, when do you stop? And I stayed till I got civil service protection. I felt like that was like, well, now you can't fire me easily, so now I quit. And
What year was this?
99 to 2001.
Okay. Wait, so the original plan was
The original plan was just to do participant observation in the academy, and 6 months on the street. But especially that 6 months on the street part, I can see why the legal department would have an issue with that. But unpaid and not actually a member, and also my grants, none of them came through, so I actually needed the paycheck. Uh, but also that gives you an excuse for being there. Otherwise, why are you hanging out so much? It's to be able to do the job made the research much really possible.
it's a brilliant but very smart of you because I mean, did you know, like, wow, this not only would this be a good, I don't know, grad student thing to write, but this would actually make a good, interesting book. A Harvard grad student in the cop car in Baltimore. I think that's fascinating. Did
Well,
you
when that
realize
became
that?
an option, well, it was a very unpleasant month between told I couldn't continue the research and my Harvard advisors being strongly against me becoming a cop. And I was like, but this is a great opportunity. Um, and it was almost the reverse of one of those cop movies. I had to sort of throw down my Harvard ID and go rogue. Um, but I mean, long story short, it did work out. But certainly, and my advisor came around, and I will say he wasn't in the policing field, Orlando Patterson. Um, but he was very. He knew that the goal. I mean, the goal one is to get a PhD to write a dissertation, but he understood that the goal was to write a book. So he wasn't. There were no regressions in my dissertation. Like, it was very much a first draft of Cop in the Hood.
I I have so many questions. I think that's fascinating.
I could just tell one story. I'm
Yeah,
turning in my
yeah.
equipment. I think it was June. I don't know. I turned in my papers in April. I think I worked till June or something. But I go and turn in my stuff in a garbage bag in the same way you pick it up, and I tell the woman there I'm retiring, and she looks she looks at my record. You ain't retiring. You're quitting. And I said, well, yeah, okay.
You should just pretended I'm a young 78. You don't good skincare. Uh, Last Baltimore question: have you met David Simon?
I have met him. I didn't. The Wire started filming when I was there. It very much kept me spiritually tied to Baltimore between quitting the police department, and me finishing my dissertation in 2004. I basically ran during those years. I met him in Australia for the first time of all places at a festival, and it was very. If you ever want to be depressed, do a book signing with David Simon, because there was a line around the Sydney Opera House for him, and I signed literally 0 copies. But I did get to chat with him, and he's been a mensch to me for my entire. I mean, he blurbed the book for me, which was nice. He didn't have to do that, but he's been good to me. But we've only met, I think, that one time in person.
Did you like The Wire?
Oh, I loved it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He really nailed. It's not 100% realistic, but it's so much more realistic than any other cop TV show or movie ever made. And he certainly nailed it from the police perspective, the one the one I know better. And it was filmed. It fictionally, most of it took place in the Western District, but it was filmed in the Eastern District. So those were literally my streets and my corners, so it was great to sort of see those after I had left.
I love the character Snoop. She was great.
Yeah,
So,
because she's a local. and her life has not gone well. But
Oh.
I think she's in prison now. The But I love the few Baltimore accents that are in the show. That's one of the things they did not do. But there are a couple characters that are clearly from
Can you
Baltimore.
do it? Can you do one?
I can't. I mean, I can do a couple words, but yeah. But no, Baltimore accent is really tough to do because it's not just different sounds. It depends where they fall, and no, you can't get it
It's
right if you're
very
not from there.
distinct. Very
Yeah,
distinct.
and I'm charmed by it. I love it, and they different words even. Um, Baltimore, for all its problems, has a very strong sense of place, and I'm kind of amazed how much the city stuck with me, given that I was only there for like 20 months in total.
So let's return back to New York City. Now, reading your book, I had mixed feelings because part of me is like, "Oh, great, the crime got reduced. Okay, that's good." But then part of me was also looking up on ChatGPT what was the price of an average apartment in the East Village in 1988 versus today, and being like, "Damn it, I could have lived in
You
Manhattan."
wouldn't have lived in the East Village. I mean, maybe the pumpkin you wanted to, but I mean, my God, it was. I mean, it was a horrible place. And you look at the pictures of just abandonment, and I mean, there are no services and heroin addicts everywhere and crime. Like, yeah, you're
It's
right. It was cheap.
hard to
You could
believe.
squat
So
a building for free. But do you want to?
let's go back to that era. I love the beginning of your book. You sort of set the scene with some stories I'd never heard about. I don't know if you can't remember the details, but can you tell this Farrakhan story? Like,
The mosque incident that
yeah,
I start with. Um, yeah, there's a mosque in Harlem, and cops get called there. I mean, we still don't fully know what happened, but it was probably a setup. Um, a call came in for a cop in distress, and it did not come from that cop. We do know that, but the cop existed, um, and cops show up, and a scuffle ensues, and cop gets shot and killed with his own gun, um, and a riotous scene gathers outside, and the mayor was primarily concerned about racial unrest, and the chief of detectives calls for a mass show of force, get people from the academy, and that's denied. Um, and a lot of people, and he, they know that the murderer is in the room. They got 8 guys there, or 9, I forget the exact number. But they, to sort of de-escalate tension, they get a promise that they will be turned over to police later, and that promise is not upheld. A guy was later tried and not convicted. Whether he was the guilty man or not, I don't know. But no one was ever convicted for the murder of that cop. And it neither the mayor nor the police commissioner attended the cop's
that was
funeral.
Ed Koch or
No,
Lindsay.
uh, it was either Beam or Lindsay. I don't remember who was mayor at that
Doesn't even
time.
go to the funeral. Wow.
Yeah, which is hard to fathom. Um, and it's still known, that incident, and of course, part of the reason. I mean, I had to selectively include these incidents as well, but that one then has a parallel to when actually, like, the day before or after Bratton becomes police commissioner, in '94. There's another very similar mosque incident, and it's handled very differently. And so it does show this sort of change that happened over the decades. And it was handled differently and better, but basically Al Sharpton wanted to throw his become the main spokesman, and Bratton just said no, not meeting with you. And people predicted race riots, and instead everything was basically fine.
I was doing some research, watching some videos about crime in New York, and just the it's the subways are so dirty. There's so much graffiti. It's just shocking. Like, so can you sort of like set the scene, maybe talk just about like what it was like going on the subway? What was the East Village in Manhattan like?
I mean, I first visited New York in '88 because I went to college. It Princeton, New Jersey in '89. Then I visited New York frequently. So I know the city basically from then. And the first time I visited, so I was still a senior in high school, a friend of mine was going to Columbia. Uh, I, first of all, I was like, oh my God, all these things that I saw in movies, they're real. It was like walking into a movie set. I mean, a lot of it was dystopian movies, but still, everything from the house under the old Thunderbolt roller coaster that was in the Woody Allen movie, even just the names, of Coney Island and Brighton Beach, um, and if you saw The Wiz, there's so many great New York movies. Um, so I mean, I loved the city, and arguably it was the city at its worst. But one of the things that struck me was there was almost no graffiti on the subway because it took another 5 or 10 years for Hollywood to to accept the fact that the trains had become graffiti free. Um, and that happened. The last train was cleaned in '89, so it was strange because you'd see like 9 trains go by and they're spotless, and then that 10th one would roll in and it looked like part of the old movie set. Um, the subway graffiti, both the story of it and how they got rid of it, um, and the fact that despite what sort of broken window says, and that did not reduce crime on the subway, cleaning up the graffiti from the subways. But it was one of those problems they said couldn't be solved, and then some mid-level bureaucrat basically solved it with the clean car program. And I think there's a lesson in that. Often people say, well, now you could say it's about homelessness. Oh, well, we can never solve this problem. Sure we can if we define it correctly and put on our thinking caps and figure out how to address what we identify as the problem. But what did reduce crime started going down in the subway when Bratton became transit chief in '91. And it's a great natural experiment because, well, first of all, the subways are cleaner. I mean, clean by New York standards. And there's also a bunch of investment. They had the trains were running better. But what really made crime go down was to go after turnstile jumpers and people with outstanding warrants and prosecute people with weapons. And the reason it's a great natural experiment is robberies plummeted on the subway and they did not go down or went down a teeny amount in the rest of the city. Um, and no root causes theory or sociological explanation is going to explain why crime goes down underground but not above ground. There kind of, excuse me, there kind of was only one variable, that of policing, that changed. Um, and that success was, well known. It was visible. People felt safer. Um, and he went to Boston first, but that's basically why Bratton got the job under Giuliani to become police commissioner in '94.
What was the clean car program?
The clean car program, and there's a picture of the commemorative T-shirt when it finished in back from the Brink. Um, they said, part of the graffiti gives the impression that no one is in control down there, and yeah, literally every surface was covered, and they tried so many things, and this was under Koch, and it didn't work because there's a whole culture around it, and it was fun, and ultimately, like, it wasn't something you could police your way out of because first of all, you're not going to chase these kids; they can outrun you. Cops aren't going to run on tracks, and what if you do catch them? At some point, it is just graffiti. You can't lock them up forever. You shouldn't lock them up forever. But instead, they said, why do people write graffiti? There's a great movie called Wild Style that covers this era, and a book, Subway Art, that shows the picture. And I have a picture from that in my book, um, which was great of the authors to let me use that. And I've got to meet Martha Cooper. We took an iconic picture of two cops looking very 70s in the 80s, standing on the train. And one of those cops is interviewed in my book, and I got to introduce them. Anyway, I digress. They said, we're going to clean one train, and that train will not leave the end of the line with graffiti on it. And they started with the 7 line from Flushing to Times Square. And, it was quickly tagged up, but then they would either, if they, all it took kind of was the political will and 2 cleaning crews. There were other things. There was some, target hardening in the subway yards and things like that. But ultimately, it said, we're not going to let your graffiti be seen on these trains. And other trains were still tagged, But they knew it was working once they noticed that graffiti writers were tagging up already tagged trains in the subway yard and leaving the blank canvas blank because they knew that it wouldn't last. And they did it train by train because that they had enough resources to manage. They couldn't do the whole system and keep it clean, but they could do it train by train. And when they moved on to the, then they moved from one line to the other, they realized that certain lines were more popular. So they started with those ones, and those were lines that ran above ground so people could see their graffiti and ran between boroughs. So, your rivals could see it as well when it went to the Bronx or whatever. Um, and it took, 5 years, which is, you could say is a long time, but it worked.
So was it the product of some like academic theory, or was it just a cop who had an idea?
No, it was a guy who worked for the transit administration. And I am oversimplifying a little. Police did play a role. Um, there was a graffiti squad, so it was, it was a little bit of all of the above. But it was things like coating the cars with wax, so you could, you could basically heat the graffiti off. Um, but no, it was a transit. It was an in-house job, and
Yeah.
along with Vinny Del Castillo, who was transit chief at the time, he was the guy, and he was the first interview I ever did because his office was next to me. Is at John Jay's, retiring this year. Um, but he, so he knew all about this program. So it was, it was a big deal, but it was primary. It was a transit administration job more than it was a police job.
I still like the idea though of a German academic with a pipe coming to New York and being like, by eliminating permanence, you devalue the. I like
I mean,
that. Better.
they did bring in George Kelling a lot, Mr. Broken Windows, and I took a class from him at Harvard, which was great. And he's in the book as well. He's one of the few professors in the book. And he's hardly that stereotypical academic because he was out there, doing shoe leather work. But he does play that role, and he was sort of seen as that by many cops. Like, who is this guy? And why is he making money in this consulting gig when we already know it all? Um, he also played a role in getting rid of squeegee men at the tail end of Mayor Dinkins' term. I mean, that is it's hard to relate today what a big deal that was, and that was another problem that supposedly couldn't be solved because these poor men are hustling because they need money, and they probably remain poor, but they're not going to dirty people's windshields anymore. And that was just a simple police job, but it requires political will.
They realized it actually wasn't that many.
Yeah,
People,
that was part of it. People thought there were thousands, and it turned out to be, I don't remember the number, but 100. And it was just relentless enforcement. And the idea was, well, what they're doing this to make money, so we can make them not make money. Um, they'll stop. And there were some arrests, but they weren't all arrested. But the threat of arrest was key. They were warned. They were cited. Some had open warrants. They would be arrested if they're cited. But then they went every 4 hours, and they made sure, because it was only about 10 places. It was the entrances to bridges and tunnels to Manhattan. And they knocked it out in a couple of weeks. That's all it took.
uh,
And,
could you?
and Giuliani and Bratton took credit for it, but it actually happened under Dinkins and Ray Kelly. And Mike Julian was the police guy who, and they're all in my book as well, except for Giuliani is not, but all the others are.
You
But
couldn't get Giuliani.
I didn't try.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. He would have talked. He would
I
have
don't
talked.
know if he would have.
Yeah,
And
he would've.
also, I mean, he was mayor. But the book, I really tried to limit the book to cops, and he wasn't a cop. Though he had been a prosecutor, I could have
He
interviewed him
talked to
about that.
Borat, for God's sake. But quickly, can you just rate and maybe just give your quick grade of the mayors before Giuliani? So let's start with John Lindsay.
And so this is before my time. I
Yeah.
remember Koch though. But Lindsay was, parodied as or disparaged, I should say, as a limousine liberal. Um, the fiscal. So I'm trying to get the timeline right about Beam and Lindsay. Um, in '75, Lindsay was mayor, right? I might have to look this up quickly just so I get it right. Mayors of NYC. Um, We got uh okay, Lindsay. Yeah, okay. So Lindsay was 66 to 73. He got the city into the fiscal crisis. I just watched a good documentary called Drop Dead City about that, about the firing of the cops and the firefighters and the sanitation strike. So Beam inherits that mess in 74 and is generally not looked about kindly, but he was in a tough place to have this huge budget. Um, and so in 75, the city was about to declare bankruptcy and instead laid off thousands of city workers, including 5,000 cops. And the sanitation department went on strike, so trash is in the street. I mean, that could also be seen as the absolute nadir of New York City. Um, but they did slowly but surely. Well, so Beam was a one-term mayor, and Koch comes in, and he's gung ho. He is. It's interesting. Koch is the only mayor, I think, in the history of the world that cops ever liked. Koch liked cops, and cops liked Koch. Um, and I found that interesting. I mean, yeah, it's cops did not like Giuliani. It's another people sometimes assume they did, but Giuliani didn't give them any pay raise and was seen as his ego was trying to control the police department. But once Koch, once the fiscal crisis kind of got settled, then the city realized, oh, you know what, we have a big crime problem going on. Crime went up when the cops were laid off. Robberies reached an all-time high in 1980. It was 1990 was close, but 1980 had the most robberies, and a lot of people were murdered in those robberies too, which contributed to the danger of the city. Because most murders, happen between people who know each other and have a beef. But the idea of people getting robbed and murdered, was a serious issue at the time. I mean, getting robbed is bad enough.
Well, did the surveys around this time, late 70s, 80s, they said most New Yorkers had been mugged, right? Or something like that?
Um, I mean, there's a line. I don't know if it was most, but it was a lot. When they in the trial um, of the subway vigilante, Bernie Getz, you know, it's in Back from the Brink. But a significant number of the jury had been the victims of crimes on the subway, and you couldn't get a jury pool that, and the question is, does that bias them? It probably did. But you couldn't get a jury pool at the time of New Yorkers who hadn't been the victims of crime.
Let's talk about real estate. So what let's just take like 1985 versus today. Where is the biggest transformation areas? So the East Village was like the Bowery where CBGB's was, right? Like
Yeah.
that the biggest one?
Well, so I do remember, and I don't know the year, but it was probably in the late '90s. Um, and I was with a friend who I knew from friend from she was Australian, but a friend from Amsterdam, and we were walking around the city, and she, of course, was oblivious to the urban savvy that people of my generation grew up with. And we hit Avenue D. So if you go east from the Bowery, you hit Alphabet City, it's down there, and you get avenues A, B, C, and D. And the idea was, what did they stand for? Assault, battery, crime, and death, or something like that. And I said, you don't understand. Like, I never had walked east of Avenue B before. Um, I had no reason to be there, and it was, quite frankly, in the late '80s. I think there was good reason not to walk east of that avenue. And the fact that we could and felt safe, and so I remember that transfer. I mean, the city was noticeably safer at this time. The biggest change is certainly there. I would say, look, in 2002, when I moved to New York, I said I didn't want to live in Fort Greene, where my girlfriend lived at the time, because I didn't want to hear gunshots from the bedroom. Um, Fort Greene has perhaps changed more. The biggest sort of gentrifying neighborhood, Williamsburg, Fort Greene, and Long Island City has changed a lot, though it was never that dangerous. It was just sort of abandoned industry. Um, and then, yeah, probably that the villa, the East that area of Alphabet City and so on. And Harlem changed a lot. I mean, so much of New York has, but it's also important to point out that a lot of New York hasn't changed. Places where a lot of New Yorkers and certainly tourists don't go, but the vast swaths of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, they haven't gentrified. They've just become a whole lot safer. The idea that certain precincts had the 7-5 had over 100 murders in a year, and then went down to like 9 one year. That's a lot of lives being saved and trauma not being happened. Uh, there's no downside to that huge reduction in shootings. Because, I mean, I look at shootings and murders because I trust the data on it. That we don't have shooting data before 1993, which shows the state of the police department and their focus that wasn't on crime. But other crimes went down in sync. It's not only the shootings and murders; it's the general, mayhem on the streets, basically.
There was, as you note in the book, there was literally a whole genre of movie that was basically like the New York crime movie with Death Wish. Do you have a
Serpico, Death. I mean, I love those movies. Taking
yeah,
the
I was
Pelham
going to
1, 2,
ask
3.
which are your favorites.
I love them all. I love that genre. I learned from that recent documentary, Drop Dead City. Those all appeared because of what's now sort of common, but movies were given tax breaks to film in New York City, and they weren't presenting New York in a great light, but they were presenting New York, and we got some great movies out of that era.
Do you know Adam Curtis by any chance?
No,
Okay, well, when you watch him, you'll have a treat. He's this British documentarian. He's the BBC's in-house documentarian.
I probably know his work.
Yeah, he's this British guy. He narrates his documentaries, and they all begin like this, like,
This is a film about why those stories have stopped making sense, and how that led us in the West to become a dangerous and destructive force in the world.
this is a story about fear and the individuals that taught a generation. Have you ever heard? No?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I like documentaries.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. He's very interesting. I think he's like a Marxist guy. But anyways, in his documentaries, recent ones, he talks a lot about New York City from this sort of class angle of basically when the city went bankrupt, basically in his
just for the record, it didn't go bankrupt. Though I say that too, but it was near They avoided bankruptcy, but yes, it kind of went bankrupt.
But in his narrative, he says that the city sort of handed itself in some ways to the bankers and the technocrats of the city to save it and stuff.
What happened that day in New York marked a radical shift in power. The banks insisted that in order to protect their loans, they should be allowed to take control of the city. The city appealed to the president, but he refused to help. So a new committee was set up to manage the city's finances. Out of 9 members, 8 of them were bankers. It was the start of an extraordinary experiment where the financial institutions took power away from the politicians and started to run society themselves.
Now, an interesting part of the story is, I'll just ask it this way. Who's Daniel Biederman?
Dan Biederman is the man who, he's still on the job. The job being the Business Improvement District, Bryant Park. I don't know what the actual name of it now. They often change those names. But he runs Bryant Park. He runs the little park that is west of Penn Station at the N train stop at 34th Street. I forget the name of it. Is that Herald Square? Maybe. So Bryant Park was seen as dangerous as the rest of the city. I mean, thinking of those movies, the Muppets Take Manhattan, Miss Piggy gets mugged in Central Park. Like, that just went without saying. I go through Central Park a lot now, and it's just, it's pretty safe. Though there was a little problem last year with some of the migrant kids running around, but they policed their way out of that. So they closed Bryant Park and redid it, and he redid it with very much of a Jane Jacobs and a broken windows approach to urban design. And William White was another person who wrote about the stuff that he used as inspiration. and people thought it was a lost cause, basically. And so these business improvement districts, the first was actually the Fulton Street Mall in Brooklyn, but that was a one-off. And then when the concept became legal, now there are dozens and dozens of them in the city.
Can you explain it just for people?
So it's a private, yeah. So it's still public space, but it's basically a private corporation that runs it. Um, and then there's a little bit of divergence in how that works, and that's why I present two of them: Times Square and Bryant Park, because they actually have different approaches. Gretchen Dykstra's approach in Times Square was to work more with the city, and Dan Biederman's was to sort of take it away from the city. But the park reopened, and it's the criticism, oh, it's gentrification, or it's just a public park, and more people use it now, and people who don't summer in the Hamptons use it. It was such an amazing success story, and this happened. It reopened in '91, and it did sort of lay the foundation. Because look, my book is about the policing perspective and the police role in the crime drop, but I want to, it wasn't entirely that. The business improvement districts, be it Grand Central Station, which I don't talk about, Bryant Park or Times Square, they showed that we can reclaim urban space. They showed that it's possible and that there's something worth saving here in the city.
So the business improvement district, was that the thing where the businesses in an area basically said, look, we're all going to pay an extra tax?
Oh yeah, so
yes. And then we're going to pay for stuff that we want, like more.
We're going to pay for stuff the city should be doing anyway, but isn't. Yeah, it's a catchment area. You have to get a majority of the businesses to agree, though they usually get more to get more people on board. But it is an actual tax. If you don't pay it, your property get taken away. It's powerful in that sense. That's the government part of it. And then you're paying for street furniture, for beautification, for homeless services. I mean, whatever you need in essence, for sanitation, for garbage to be picked up. And it does privatize things that I think should be a city function, but clearly the city wasn't providing it. And Gretchen Dykstra has a good line about Times Square because people complain about the Disneyfication, and she said it was, you're looking at it through rose-tinted glasses. You're glorifying what was bad. It was not good to have 42nd Street entirely pimps, hustlers, porn theaters, and drug dealers. And this also, but that happened under Dinkins. It's another thing that people often get the time frame wrong. It was Dinkins who signed the deal with Disney. But I remember she talks about it specifically the record store that opened up. It made it a destination, and it was open late. And you could go in there and hang out, not buy anything and hang out for an hour or two and, listen to the latest music when that was, the way you had to discover the latest music.
And I had always wondered on highways what this whole adopt a highway thing was. I never understood that. When I was researching for this, I realized it sort of comes out of this related thing where these companies would be like, look, I want the city to look nice on these corridors. So we'll pay for, it to look nice because they'll try.
Yeah. But they get a little ad out of it. I mean, that's an important part.
Right.
It is just supplementing the city coffer. Like, it's not a different way of doing business. That's what's so, I think, powerful about Dan Biederman's story in Bryant Park is he modeled it after resort hotels in Disney World and said they provide a good service, and they make people feel safe. And you can get this sort of positive feedback loop. I mean, Bryant Park still probably has the nicest public bathroom in New York City, and it's famous for having flowers in it, and it does. And if you're on 42nd Street by the library, I recommend taking a piss there.
You said it reopened. How long was it? Was it closed?
It was closed for many years,
Really?
Partly because of they expanded the library underground. The Bryant Park is right behind the main branch of the New York Public Library. So it was supposed to be closed for a little bit, and then it ended up closed for a long time as they were doing this massive underground building underneath it. But that probably, they closed Tompkins Square Park later, which I talk about the riots there a little bit, but I don't really get into that story. It's kind of like a hard reset. You clear everyone out of the park, get people to change their habits so that when you do reopen it, it's not as likely to fall into its old ways.
So before we get to the revolution that your book, Back from the Brink, details, can we talk about the Crown Heights riots and maybe your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it I mean the backstory is I think it's 91, is it not? There I that's one of the places, you know, a lot of the stuff in my that was one of the places where I think, and I don't know what part of it, there is some original new revelations in that by talking to the people who were there. And maybe I spend too much time on it. I don't know. But in many ways, from the policing side, it's important. I mean, it was a real event. It's important for what happened, but it's also symbolic in that it was a race riot. And it kind of destroyed Dinkins' political career because he was supposed to be good on that issue, and he wasn't. So let me get this right. I'm gonna if I pull it up. So the cops were, and there was such a weird confluence of events. Like it never should have happened. That's what Mike Julian said. He's right. Um, a Hasidic rabbi was given, for reasons no one knew, a police escort every week back from the cemetery to his home.
Schneerson?
Yeah,
Okay, so this is the the Rebbe of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which is has grown into this huge Orthodox Jewish strain of Orthodox Judaism, and they primarily live in Crown Heights. Yeah,
yeah, and they got their headquarters are on Eastern Parkway.
7070.
770 Eastern Parkway. It's one of the addresses, you know, that every cop in New York City knows. Right. And so the police, someone says, "Why are we giving this rabbi this escort?" And the police department does a little internal, you know, investigation and says, "Let's not do this." But it was probably the chief of department, Robert Johnson Jr., who maybe he was retiring, and he maybe made, you know, maybe he's the one, I don't know, maybe he's the one that made the agreement. But anyway, he said, "Can we you know, I gave my word or something. Let's at least do it for one more week until I'm out of the job." And that seemed reasonable. Whatever, they've been doing it for years. But so you end up in this situation, and I do want to actually get this right. The car. So they're coming back. There's a car with a police light, and they have the green light, but the light turns red. And a couple cars later, one of the cops and one of the cars in this small convoy of like 4 cars or something runs the red light and gets T-boned by a car coming perpendicular that has the green light, and the car kills a kid and also injures his sister, I believe. And a Jewish volunteer ambulance comes, and it doesn't have any equipment or the equipment needed, and they call for a professional ambulance. And when that ambulance is en route, they take the mildly injured occupants of the Hasidic Jewish people in the car. And so immediately rumors start, you know, not unjustifiably but false, that the ambulance, the Jewish ambulance, let the black kid die. Gavin Cato is his name, 7 years old. And so here, yeah, Johnson's retired. Basically, there's no one running the department. Everyone's new. Some blacks go through looking for a Jew to attack. They find one, Yankel Rosenbaum. They stab him. He shouldn't have. He died, but he shouldn't have. But doctors missed internal bleeding. The police come in and retreat. They're at peril. They don't know what to do, and they get there's no orders being given, but they know that Dinkins doesn't want an overreaction, and they do as well, let people burn themselves out. Maybe the rioters are justified in their cause. And it's presented very much as sort of it was blacks against Jews, but it was far more one-sided than the newspapers were reporting, and it was far more violent than the newspapers were reporting, and far more anti-Semitic than the newspapers were reporting. And Ray Kelly, who became commissioner, his first deputy commissioner, but he's told not to. He was previously told not to get involved in operations. Here's the line. Mike Giuliani says, "There's no chief of department. RJJ Jr. is gone. The new chief of department's on vacation. The new chief of patrol is in charge but frozen. The Brooklyn commander is scared. There's a new precinct commander who started that day, and they're all afraid to do anything because of Dinkins. Who makes that shit up?" On day 3, the mayor and the police commissioner, Lee Brown, known as Out-of-Town Brown, go to visit the family of the victim of the black kid who was killed, and their car gets stoned, and it's the only time that the police commissioner ever put out a distress call for officer needs urgent assistance. But that's on day 3 is finally now when Dinkins realizes and Lee Brown, like, oh my God, this is really serious, and they set up. They say we got to end this. They could have done that on day 1, but instead they did it on day 3. Ray Kelly is told to take charge. Timony comes up with a plan, and they do basically overnight end this with heavy legal crowd control and policing, and they let people protest, and Lou Animo's in charge of that, and they set up one line of cops between protesters and stores so they don't get broken and looted, and another between protesters in the street, and they say, look, if you go in the street, we're going to arrest you, but other than that, we'll take you wherever you want to go. And there are someone tested, of course, and they arrest the person, but in any crowd like that, most people aren't trying to cause destruction, and so they did stop it. And all those people who were in charge of that, rose in the department quite prominently. Mike Giuliani has one quarter in front, so the 3 sectors in front of 7-7 Eastern Parkway. Lou Animone has sort of the epicenter, and then there's a third guy who isn't in the book, who's further out. But it was seen as Dinkins just wasn't running the city. And then that was followed by Washington Heights riots, and Dinkins always seemed to side with.
What was that about?
A drug dealer by the name of Kiko Garcia was shot and killed by a cop, and after pulling a gun on the cop. But rumors were that the cop executed with an unarmed black man or a Dominican man with his hands up. Dinkins paid for the family funeral in the Dominican Republic and flew the family out there, and that pissed off cops to no end. That is more than anything is what led to the so-called police riot at City Hall soon after that, which was nominally about the Civilian Complaint Review Board, but it was really just an anti-Dinkins.
And what just briefly, what happened there?
Cops surrounded City Hall, stormed City Hall. One of the main guys
in uniform?
No, out of uniform.
Okay.
And beat up a reporter. Many were drunk. Some were clearly racist. There were caricatures of Dinkins as a black man. And, the guy in my book is the cop in uniform at the top of the steps of City Hall, and he's afraid they're going to get crushed in this stampede because the cops in the building lock the doors and leave a couple cops out of the door outside. It was
wow.
It's described anywhere from a rowdy protest to a racist drunken riot, and the truth is probably all of the above.
Day or night? Was it nighttime or?
No, it was daytime.
Wow.
When a reporter got, I think, beaten up. It was what today would be called a mostly peaceful protest, but it was not entirely peaceful.
Wow.
And it certainly, it did not make the cops look
Be-
good.
Before we talk about Brandon, just really quickly, I've heard that the Central Park Five. I heard a convincing case by someone that maybe that's not as clear that they were innocent. Is that true?
I wasn't there. I first heard that from Lenny Levitt, who's in my book. He doesn't say that in my book. But he said anybody who actually watched the confessions, they were, they knew too much. They were there. Now, just because so they were, their convictions were vacated. That doesn't mean they were innocent. Somebody else was guilty. A homeless guy that was later matched by DNA of semen at the scene. And so part of the problem was he was not sought after once they got the confessions of the Central Park Five. But the idea that they were innocent is, I think, factually wrong. But history has made another story around that. The thing about the Central Park Five, the confessions are out there. You can watch them. They're on YouTube somewhere. And they weren't. What they were convicted of was basically, being part of a greater crime scene. They were part of a greater crime scene. Again, who did what exactly? It's not clear. But when they talk about it, they're different people isolated talking about the exact same incident in the same way. And they also attacked bicyclists beforehand too. They, if nothing else, they were guilty of standard assault before that. But
okay, Bill Bratton. Who is this guy? Is he from New York?
No, he's from Boston.
Boston. Okay.
Still has the Boston accent quite strongly,
yes,
which
yes.
is kind of funny. You can't lose it. He rises. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's a Boston cop. He has a very quick rise through a bunch of small departments before he is tapped to be transit police. And at the time, that was a hard shift to bring in an outsider from to the transit police department, which was a separate police department at the time. And he says broken windows is the only theory that he's ever subscribed to. And not zero tolerance policing, but broken windows. But crime plummets on the subway dramatically through a focus on, as I said, open warrants, turnstile jumping. They also, there's an important court case that makes this all possible, which declares that begging is not a constitutionally protected right on the subway because it is a confined space. So they're allowed to enforce subway rules. And without that court decision, I don't know if any of this would have happened. And it also applied to Port Authority, which I talk about, and commuter rails, which I don't. The thing about Bratton, so to jump forward a bit, so then be brief. He's got a right-hand man, Jack Maple. Bratton, I think, is a good judge of talent, and Jack Maple had not a checkered career, controversial career, because he was an aggressive cop, and the brass didn't like him. And he wrote a letter that actually got passed up the chain of command in the transit department to meet with Bratton, and he was just a lieutenant at the time, but Bratton makes him his right hand man, and so this is a smart guy. He had a GED. He's not college educated. Maple's from Queens, but the two together, Bratton is a little bit hands off, and especially as the NYPD commissioner, he's a good politician, and Maple is his sort of get your feet dirty in the department and get things done guy.
When I looked him up, I did a double take because I clicked on and I saw the Wikipedia, and then I looked at my screen. I said, "That can't be right. That must be about some actor from the silent era." I because it had a picture of a guy in this like old fashioned hat.
Spats. Yeah, he when he became detective, he said, I'm gonna dress to the nines. And one of the things I it isn't a surprise, but I do try and get across. Partly, I was inspired by Studs Terkel's focus on working men and women. Um, these are all working class guys. Uh, Bratton today wears a tailored suit and with cufflinks, and were it not for his Boston accent, he looks like could be part of the waspy elite. Um, but he's a Catholic from Boston. Um, Maple, I'm most of the way through this book, and everyone has a Jack Maple story. And I don't know if you heard, like, if you listen to Saturday Night Live people, anyone who's been involved in that show, when they talk about Lorne Michaels, always puts on this Lorne Michaels voice.
Yeah. Right.
I was just listening to Conan O'Brien do that.
Yes.
They all do that. Everyone that talks about Jack Maple puts on this Jack Maple voice. And the problem is he's dead. I'm writing an oral history, and he died in 2001. He died far too young. And I didn't know what, like, he's the main character, and I can't put him in the book. Another guy, Timony, did interviews at John Jay College, so he also passed away, but I was able to access these interviews. So those are the two people I never spoke to who are in the book. And God bless Chris Mitchell, who co-wrote Maple's autobiography. I tracked him down, and he graciously sent me all the tapes that he recorded in 1996 and 7, or maybe a year later, that he interviewed Jack Maple, and they wrote the book. Chris Mitchell did the writing, but it's a co-authored book. And I got 40 hours of Jack Maple tapes. Before that, I would joke, literally and figuratively, I don't have Jack. And suddenly I did have Jack Maple, and I'm actually I've been in touch with his family quite recently. His son's a cop. His daughter, I just had exchanged. I've been able to share these, and I feel like I've done a good deed for his children to be able. They hadn't heard these tapes.
Can we just go back to 82 and the Broken Windows article in The Atlantic, just briefly? So James Q. Wilson, academic at Harvard, right? And I'm blanking on the other guy's name.
George Kelly.
Yeah. So could you just say a word? I mean, I'm just thinking myself, can you even think of sort of articles of that type that have had more impact than that one?
I'm sure there's
I'm sure there are,
but very few.
Yeah.
More recently, you might say, well, that was a book. I'm thinking of Ta-Nehisi Coates had a great impact. There's sometimes these things have traction. I wasn't buddy with him, but I knew George Kelling from when I took a class with him as a grad student at the Kennedy School in 96 or 97. Till I think I was the last person to interview him before he died. And I mean, even he says, look, if we had known the impact that article would have, like, we might have written it differently. We might have been a bit, we would have changed a few things. Like, we didn't know. They were just, writing a magazine article at some point. Maybe we would have called it something different. He says perhaps Broken Windows was the wrong phrase. And, he spent the rest of his life trying to, there's a lot of disingenuous, there's some legitimate criticism because it is just a sort of theory that it's not a scientific theory. But there's a lot of disingenuous criticism from people who just don't want more assertive policing. And it is more assertive policing. But they mischaracterized it from day one and continue to do so. But he also acknowledges, look, maybe we weren't clear enough exactly, though they are pretty clear, but what it is and what it isn't. And he wrote things afterwards. But ultimately it says, we're going to trust police officers. They're smarter than you think. He was a big proponent of foot patrol. It was about policing public space and keeping public space open to the public. And it is very much rooted in Jane Jacobs. When I was in his class and we read the article, I mentioned that to him. Like, isn't this just Jane Jacobs? And he goes, yes. I'm going to talk about her next week. And his face lit up. And I think that's why I got an A in the class, because I recognized the Jane Jacobs link before, he officially brought it up. And in that, it's funny because I mean, they're saying the same things. And Jane Jacob did write a chapter in Death and Life of Great American Cities on policing and the sidewalk. And it's not, I mean, maybe it is profound. It's so simple, but if no one had said it before, but this idea that all streets do or should police themselves, that the presence of people should be seen as a public safety asset and not a problem. It's that the city cannot function as a suburb. It needs to be. You have to celebrate what's a city. And when it was more revolutionary when Jane Jacobs wrote this in the '60s, because went against urban design and garden cities, and everybody went against Le Corbusier to Robert Moses, but broken windows to some extent, and George Kelly said maybe just it gave police the excuse to do what everyone wanted them to do all along.
Right. And also this idea that little criminal acts like jumping a turnstile, that those little actions communicate a atmosphere, right, of disorder that.
Now, so the theory, and I think the weakest part of it is, if you take care of the little things, I don't think the big things take care of themselves. And there's a great quote towards the end of my book, from John Miller, that says you can pretend it's all like touchy-feely, and if you pick up trash, then people are going to stop murdering each other. But ultimately what it did, well, I would say this: public disorder matters for its own sake. I don't want someone crapping on my stoop, not because of future crime it might lead to, because I don't want crap on my stoop. So that does create public fear, and that matters. So it's addressing disorder for its own sake. It's saying that fear, which is very hard to measure, that public fear should be reducing fear should be a focus of policing. But then what it did is it allowed police to contact, to touch, to get their hands on and get up in the business of repeat violent offenders. I mean, either you're going to pick up the pieces after a shooting, or you're going to, I mean, you know who the shooters are. You may not be able to prove it in court yet, but it's the same people, the same day, every day, on the same corner. I mean, I saw this as a cop. Like, this is an active drug corner. I don't know who exactly has done what, but I know that collectively this group is the problem. And some may be, there might be ringleaders and hangers-on that aren't, and so on. But do you want the repeat violent offenders policed, or do you not? And Broken Windows says, yes, let's do that. And conveniently, anyone who's going to mug somebody on the subway, it's like they physically can't pay their fare. They have to jump the turnstile. It's part of the mindset or mentality or whatever. So in that sense, yeah, you can. That is a case where maybe cracking down on the little things does prevent serious crime. But it's about focusing on the people who actually commit the crime, because there are not that many of them. If they got open warrants, let's go and get them. There's already a warrant out for the rest. Why are we, let's do it on our time.
So the crime drop is extraordinary. I don't know if you have the numbers at the top of your head, but do you? Because they're so dramatic. And
well, I mean, in the grand scheme, murders went down from 2,200 to under 300, and other crimes fell in sync. And the peak years of 94 to 96, I think it was like 1,700 to 800 or something. So that was, I mean, and this was supposed to be impossible. Meanwhile, poverty in New York went up. Giuliani was slashing social programs. I mean, that has other bad effects. But this idea that's so prevalent that we can't police our way out of crime problems, and we need to fix society. Well, I don't know if we're ever going to fix society in that way, but we don't have to wait. We can just go after violent criminals.
I was amazed by, you said poverty went up, because the common belief is that New York just became like a rich person playground.
Inequality didn't. I think it did become richer. But yeah, if people want to argue that crime is good because it prevents gentrification, they're really not thinking
But the
of the
city actually
victim.
had more poverty.
Yeah, poverty increased
Really?
slightly in percentage and absolute numbers in the 90s. And the other thing is the idea that so in 2000 there were 1.67 million New Yorkers living in poverty. That would have been the fifth largest city in America. The idea that that somehow is a criminal group bothers me, because it's not. Some are, but if 1.67 million, no, they're not. You don't have 1.67 million, muggers, and I mean, most of them are going to work and still in poverty. Some of them aren't going to work and are in poverty. Um, and reducing poverty is important, but if you want to focus on crime, focus on crime.
Let, let's get into COMPSTAT, which there's some of these programs, like one's called Safe Streets. I heard it. I was like, that's such a lame name. I love this name, COMPSTAT. That sounds so cool,
I am happy to have the origin story, which I'd never. There are many.
Tell me, tell
It's
me.
almost achieved myth. Um, Well, I mean, John Yowen during a snowstorm writes the code for it. He's a computer tinkerer at the time. Like so, and then they come up with a name in a room and trying to and it has to be 8 characters long because that's what the DAW's file structure, which I'm old enough to remember, had a maximum of 8 characters. And so they're just throwing out names, and basically they stumble across that one and say it sounds cool, and so ComStat is born. At that time, it was ComStat.com. That was the old.
It's
Which
great
then
because it sounds like a machine. You know what I mean?
And so it's often equated, and Jack Maple I think is hilarious when he says, I don't even like computers. It's funny that people link me with high tech. The point it was it simply presented things on an overhead project on a computer projection, like basically a early version of PowerPoint, where before that it had been an overhead projector. It was a crime map. It wasn't in that sense. It wasn't revolutionary, but it wowed people because it was a big screen and they could pull things up and not play around with acetate overhead projector
So,
screens.
so who came up with the idea of we're gonna have a, a big room and we're all going to look at this projector and put these dots on it? Whose idea was that?
That's Jack Maple and Lou Anemone. Lou Anemone, probably because he's still alive and well, doesn't get as much credit as he should. But that I like. So the origin story really starts when Bratton becomes police commissioner and Maple stays with him trusted as his trusted lieutenant. And Jack Maple asks, this is 1994, how many people were shot last year in New York City? Which seems like a pretty basic question, and nobody knows. Um, that level of dysfunction and apathy within the organization is hard to fathom, and I try and present that in those chapters that precede the crime drop. But that the New York Police Department didn't know how many people were shot in the city because it wasn't a Part 1 FBI crime statistic. That's they had. I mean, they were at some level keeping track of shootings, but there was they weren't consolidating that data. So Jack Maple says, well, let's count them. Let's go back and figure out how many people were shot last year. And they do, and it was 5,000 some. We still don't know how many people were shot in 1990, and it was probably over 7,000, but we just don't know. So we only have shooting data going back to 1993 now. And the first, you have to, it's just a more efficient version of a pin map marking crimes. But then you start to see patterns. Jack Maple loved crime mapping. And to get the data is, it's a lot of head knocking and hard work because people, to work for people.
So they get this data, they do what should have been done long ago.
Yeah.
And then I would assume once they start looking, I think it's brilliant, but it's obvious, but they were the first ones to do it, to be able to visually look at these dots. What do they see?
Some of it is what they already knew, that a lot of crime happens in a lot of very small places. Because they did have pin maps before this. And cops on the street, again, know the streets. So some of it, but it was centralizing it. A huge part of it, though, wasn't about the data necessarily. It was about holding the precinct commanders accountable for it. That was the philosophical shift. But the data itself did also show that when shootings happen, a lot of shootings are happening on a Friday and Saturday night, and all the specialized units work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So let's change that. Now, that's a huge change because people liked working 9 to 5, and they had their various excuses. And Jack Maple says, no, we're going to deploy people to be where and when the crime is happening. Like, that's step one. And again, it doesn't seem that brilliant, and yet no one had done it before.
So there was resistance, or
Oh,
no?
yeah, because look, before that, as long as you avoided corruption, as long as race riots weren't happening, as long as there was no big scandal, and as long as you made 3 robbery arrests for every 10 robberies, you were fine. And life went on. And sometimes crime goes up and sometimes crime goes down. And so the difference is, and did you arrest the right person? That's, going back to the Central Park Five, that's what, whatever their culpability is, it's important to mention they didn't arrest the right person. They did not arrest the key person, the guy who raped her. And he did go on to rape again, I think, before they caught him. So yeah, there were a bunch of robberies. Before they would say, did you make any arrests? And they go, yeah, we made 4 arrests. Oh, that's great. But did it stop the robberies? And if it didn't, then you didn't arrest the right people. Burglars commit a lot of burglaries. So I don't want to just arrest one and have the burglaries continue. One very innovative thing Jack Maple did is they started to interrogate everybody arrested. It was about stopping the crime, not just making an arrest, and that's a key and fundamental thing in policing. If you have stolen subway tokens, where are you selling them? I don't just want to arrest the car thief. I want to go after the chop shop. I want to bring down the whole operation from start to finish. I want to know who they're working with. I need and that's a lot of hard work to do. But they started doing that.
Are they running this data back in the 90s through any kind of computer programming?
Only simple, the spreadsheet basically level.
Okay, so today, I would imagine that this would be perfect for AI to, that you could just
I don't
give
know.
this.
AI still makes a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, but I would think you could give it the data and would say this street corner on Friday nights you need to put 30% of your whatever top cops there or something. Are they doing that now or not really?
I don't know.
Okay.
There are a lot of crime analysts. I don't think AI is ready for prime time yet. I don't know if it ever will be. I mean,
And
I wonder. I don't know.
So, are there any other maybe sub insights that you think were very important beyond establishing COMPSTAT in the 90s for NYPD?
Normally I mock things or roll my eyes at mission statements, but it really, fundamentally, it just came down to a different mission statement. They were going to care about crime, disorder, and fear of crime. Figure out what in a way, keep it simple, but figure out what the problem is and do problem solving, and just do it relentlessly, and focus on that. It's going to be different for each city, a little bit for each neighborhood, but it's policing as a verb. And take ownership. That was when Bratton did become police commissioner. He said we're going to bring down crime, 15%, and or I think he said double digits, and it was 15%. But no one had done that before. No police commissioner. Like, that's a ballsy thing to do. To say, hold me, mark my words, and hold me responsible for this. Because people said it was impossible, and then he went and did it. The great man theory of history isn't very popular, but I don't know how, it does require good leadership, and I don't know how you find that, how you make that, how you perpetuate that. It can fall apart quickly. A lot of it's collaboration. And, this is the police officers talking and back from the Brink, but it was other agencies wanted to get involved. It is making the city or departments or, just less lethargic, and putting them all in the same room. Try, I not, not wanting to surround yourself with yes men. Trying to get honest perspectives from things. I mean, that was part of it too, is they asked.
One word that we don't associate with policing is creativity.
Yeah.
Do you think that was also sort of part of the magic?
Yeah,
recipe?
so said the people that were there. I mean, I don't focus. I mentioned one or two in passing because I think it's part of the story. But they tried things that didn't work. But then they said, okay, that didn't work. No harm. No harm. No foul. Then let's try something again. It was also such a brief period because remember, Giuliani fired Bratton in '96.
Why?
So this was why? Because Bratton was on the cover of Time magazine, and Giuliani didn't appreciate that.
Literally, that it's that petty.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But they set up a system that was able to perpetuate itself for a long time. I think it's not to the present day necessarily, but it did sort of get better, and then stop, question, and frisk set everything back, and 15 years later or 20 years later. But it's a tough. It's not like a private business, and it shouldn't be. You have people who have their job because of a civil service test. You can get promoted up to the rank of captain based on those tests, and then it's discretionary. You can't fire people. I mean, you can, and cops do get fired, but you can't really fire people. You don't have. How do you motivate people who have a lot of job security and earn a steady paycheck? And that was, I think, the real accomplishment as cops started saying, we can, having greater professional pride again, and saying we can do our job. Because some of it, some of it, it's just getting new uniforms, and they went from the revolver to a semi-automatic pistol. Like, that was a huge deal. Probably a bigger deal than it should have been.
What was his work ethic like, Bratton?
Strong. I don't know. I mean, it's funny. I think extreme would be, but the other people, I didn't ask Bratton about that. I mean, Jack Maple was sleeping in the office. Other people do talk about how they never saw their family during this era. It was very rough for work-life balance for these people. They were expected to give it their all. And this is because these aren't the rank and file. These are, precinct commanders. And they said, this is this is the chance of my career. I don't want to fuck it up. But I think it was very rough generally on a lot of families because they were putting in long, long hours.
And Maple has like a light bulb moment when he's out drinking one night. Is he right?
Yeah, he's at Elaine's and comes up with this basic 4-point plan that becomes the COMPSTAT is really these meetings, but they kind of get blurred. But the crime prevention strategy is rapid, is getting accurate, timely intelligence. Rapid deployment, effective tactics, and then follow-up and assessment, which are the subtitles to the chapters of the book at that point. And then rinse and repeat. And it is basically just a problem-solving thing. There are other ways you can do that, but that's the one that he came up with. And that became the guiding principle. Figure out where the crime is happening, figure out what you're going to do about it, and then see if it works. And, and don't let up.
So COMPSTAT basically, I assume, gets copied by, is it like every major city, basically?
Pretty much. And one of the criticisms, and I think unfairly, is, crime went down everywhere, so clearly it wasn't what the NYPD did. Well, first of all, it went down more in New York. It went down first in New York. And Bratton was on the cover of Time magazine. This wasn't a secret. They were winning presidential awards. The first 6 months, I would say, people were just in denial, and then it became undeniable what was going on. And when that happened, they had a literal road team to act on the road, and people were coming into COMPSTAT to visit. And the fact that it does start basically with a simple mission statement, say, hey, let's go out there and police again and focus on crime, it's super easy to copy. I mean, you still need the work and the talent and the leadership. But yeah, other departments immediately said, I want to get on this crime reduction bandwagon. I mean, what a great thing is going
It,
on.
it, it's
So
sort of
the fact that it
go ahead.
happened everywhere, I think, is in large part because of what happened in New York.
It's sort of interesting that Bloomberg comes after because, Bloomberg makes his billions as a data guy, or basically the Bloomberg terminal, giving you all the data right away. That's what it's all about. So stop and frisk, you think that was a horrible mistake?
Yeah, in hindsight, certainly, and even at the time, it was pretty bad. I mean, so it's there is some irony in it in that so cops were stopped. Like when I was a cop, I didn't fill out stop reports because no one cared. It was paperwork. I also thought it was rude if you stop someone and the person is innocent. Um, then to ask for his information, like he doesn't want to share that with me anyway. So just be polite and you handle it professionally. But I wasn't filling out the stop forms. No one cared. Then the NYCOU demanded that these forms get filled out. I mean, as they were supposed to be. Uh, but that was so the NYPD started keeping track in 2002, and the tail started wagging the dog, and the stops became a measure of officer productivity, and they increased every year. They're probably artificially inflated at the end. I mean, there's stories, true or not, of cops going to cemeteries to get names and date of births. Every car stop, you'd fill out a stop form because you were rewarded for this. And it went up to near 700,000 into 2011. Um, that's a lot of stops. And the thing is, shootings weren't going down that much because it wasn't focused on crime. It was just stops are good. That was the mentality. And the department was not coming up with new ideas by and large. There were some. The focus, of course, at that time was largely on terrorism. Um, and, that Greg Kelly did a great job with that, in that there was no follow up to 9/11. But they just went out of control. And I started hearing from cops. I started teaching in 2004, and cops are telling me they're getting pressured to produce these numbers, and it's not right, because it wasn't focused on any specific problem. And then when, because of lawsuit, and stops plummeted from 500,000 to 50,000 in 2 years, um, and crime went down again. So we know in hindsight that you can reduce crime and not stop 685,000. Well, lots of repeat customers in that, I'm sure, but not conduct 685,000 stops. Um, you have to police smarter. Um, and it set policing back for years. And I had students of mine were routinely stopped. And I remember one saying, well, why don't they stop the drug dealers in front of my building instead of me going to the subway? And I was like, well, I think because you're a soft target, because they know that you're not a criminal, your warrant's not going to pop, you're not going to resist, and they get the stat. And it was horrible.
Let's talk about some of the critics of the people who brought New York City back from the brink. I'm thinking of two people I'd like to. I'm not sure if you've read the books. So Matt Taibbi wrote. This is back before his sort of political change, which is fine. He wrote a book about Eric Gardner, who was this guy selling loose cigarettes on the street, who died in a chokehold. And Matt Taibbi sort of pointed at broken windows theory as sort of the causing it in some way. That's one thing. Thoughts on that? But also, I wonder about it's a very famous book. I wonder if you've read it. That book, The New Jim Crow by
Michelle
Michelle.
Alexander.
Yeah. Which I would assume, assume sort of takes that view towards people like Brand and stuff like that. So, what are your thoughts on those two?
There is a strong, especially in academia, there is there's just a lot of opposition to policing. People who live in safe neighborhoods theorize. I mean, I agree with a lot of the when it came out. I agreed with a lot of Michelle Alexander's book, but it also set the groundwork for seeing everything exclusively through the lens of race, and I think that's been counterproductive. Um, Eric Garner died. It was not. He was not being choked. I mean, he was choked. And then he died. He was not choked till he died. I always thought perhaps the paramedics got off a bit easy in that. Maybe he shouldn't have died. The other thing is sometimes people do die.
Yeah, he was a huge guy. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did the cops have to do what they had to do? Well, they could have walked away. But I mean, that's the alternative. I mean, at some point, people are going to die at the hands of police. Sometimes justifiably, sometimes it'll be a tragedy, which I'd say that one was, and sometimes by mistake. You don't have he was under arrest. Yeah, we could just decriminalize all this stuff, and then, which we effectively did in 2020, and then violence goes up. You know, should it be okay for him to sell Lucy cigarettes? I mean, yeah, enforcement does mean police get involved. And the idea that so we should stop enforcement, which is really what people say. And, well, no, I think policing and people generally who live in these neighborhoods who are making these quality of life complaints, you can reduce the number. And, and you have to figure out, why did this happen? Was it preventable? There was a very young sergeant at the scene who maybe didn't handle it great. But I don't know. It's funny because not directly because of that, but now bodegas are selling illegal cigarettes, and we have all these illegal weed stores. He was a public disorder problem. Does that mean he should die? Absolutely not. But I don't know who's got to.
It's sort of strange. Do you remember, like, last year, that video came out of the New York cops like punching that guy, and he was like in a wheelchair or something. He was like strapped. He was like literally strapped to something, and they were just like beating the crap out. And what I noticed was, I think it was during the Gaza protests. That's probably why. But it did not get any attention. I was like, this is much worse.
It is odd how some things get traction and some don't. And I've never quite figured out why and how. There were some cops. I just saw a video last night of they shot a guy who was ramming their car. And the guy had previously, I mean, he was, I did not shed a tear for the victim, unfortunately. But it was not a good shooting. Yeah. And I don't know, the victim was white, so there's no racial angle, and it wasn't a big city, so I don't think, but that one I think will fade very quickly. And I'm thinking, well, here is, like, this is something that we should be, like, that shouldn't have happened. I don't know whether it's bad training but there should be some accountability for that. Maybe there will be. But no, it's weird how, given how many cops there are and how many interactions and how many of them do go bad and how many of them look bad but aren't bad, some get the public. I think now we're focused on Trump and Gaza, and a lot of the people who would protest the police are protesting other things now.
So the New York City is having a mayor's race.
Mm-hmm.
Zohran Mamdani is in the race. What do you make of his policing plan?
I think it would be a disaster. He's my state rep, by the way. Won't return my phone calls either. He may be the mayor. It's so weird to me. We went through de Blasio, and this is de Blasio on steroids, and it's not going to. I don't think he has the experience, but more importantly, I think his policies are. I mean, he wants to defund the police and defund transit, and somehow that's considered. I mean, we've been through it before. I mean, it's this huge public safety plan that has been tried and failed in other cities, and will be just a mountain of corruption and waste. But he's incredibly charismatic. But my God, it's an important job, mayor of New York, and and I don't want foreign politics to be an issue. I want someone who can run New York City. The problem is there's not any great alternative. You know, Andrew Cuomo is by most accounts, a vile human being. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a bad mayor, but I don't think people want to work for him. We'll see. And so few people vote in the Democratic primary. I voted yesterday.
Can I? Sorry.
That doesn't take many votes to win, and it's a failure of local democracy.
Can I ask you? His father basically, and he has a lot of friends, and I'm guessing he has the same view. I wish media had asked him. His father believes that Jews that aren't anti-Zionists are basically Nazis, modern Nazis. When, like, let's say there's like a synagogue situation where like there's some protesters surrounding some synagogue in New York. How do you think he would handle that?
I don't know. It depends on does he, as de Blasio did, sort of let the police department more or less do its job and just, talk in one way and then let police I mean, de Blasio reappointed Bratton as commissioner, let's not forget. He's an unknown. I don't know. I don't know how radical he is, but I mean, I actually read the platform of DSA, the national platform, and it's, full-on Marxist revolutionary. They want to they literally want to make a new constitution and abolish capitalism. I would like to know his opinion on that.
Thank you so much, Peter.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.